It was a crisp autumn evening in New York City, where towering skyscrapers cast long shadows over bustling streets. In his luxury penthouse apartment overlooking Central Park, Henry Lewis, a 42-year-old self-made billionaire, stood alone by the massive floor-to-ceiling windows. The city shimmered beneath him, but Henry barely noticed the view. Instead, he sipped his glass of bourbon, lost in thought. To the outside world, Henry had everything: money, power, influence. He was the CEO of Lewis Enterprises, a global conglomerate that had made him one of the most respected businessmen of his generation. But success had come at a cost. His 2 marriages had failed, leaving behind bitter memories and broken trust. He believed love was nothing more than a temporary illusion, one that distracted from purpose. But tonight, something weighed heavily on his mind. Despite his immense wealth and meticulous control over every aspect of his life, there was one thing he hadn't secured: an heir, a child to carry on his legacy. To Henry, this wasn't about sentimentality or family bonding. It was a practical need. He saw a child as an investment, a continuation of everything he had built. But there was one condition: there could be no emotional entanglements, no failed marriages, no messy relationships. This time, he needed a clear, emotionless arrangement, one that would give him exactly what he wanted without the chaos of love or betrayal. As Henry placed his glass down, the wheels of a plan began turning in his mind. By the time dawn broke, he had already made his decision. The next day, Henry drove through the city in his sleek black sports car, eyes scanning the streets. He didn't know exactly what he was looking for, but he trusted his instincts to guide him. It was then, while stopped at a red light downtown, that he noticed her. Sitting on the sidewalk, Layla Parker, a young woman with messy brown hair and piercing blue eyes, sketched furiously on a piece of worn paper. She looked thin, exhausted, and invisible to everyone around her, but Henry couldn't help but be drawn in by the intensity of her focus. She seemed lost in her art, oblivious to the world. As the light turned green, he hesitated, a rare moment of indecision flickering through him. He sped away, shaking the thought from his mind. But a few blocks later, he pulled into a parking lot and leaned forward on the steering wheel, conflicted. Something about her had struck him. He wasn't sure if it was curiosity or destiny, but he knew he had to return. When he drove back, Layla was still there, now leaning her paper against the wall. Henry pulled up to the curb, rolled down the window, and called out to her. "Hey you, come here." His voice was direct, cold, exactly how he conducted all his business transactions. Layla hesitated, her suspicious eyes narrowing as she looked at the well-dressed man in the expensive car. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice low but steady. "Get in," Henry replied. "I have a proposition for you." Layla stood on the sidewalk, her arms crossed, unsure whether to walk away or take the bait. She had met plenty of men who made offers to women like her, none of them good. But something about Henry's demeanor set him apart. He wasn't leering. He wasn't begging. He had the commanding presence of someone used to getting what he wanted. "I'm not interested," she said, stepping back. Henry's jaw tightened, but his gaze didn't waver. "I'm not offering what you think," he replied coolly. "This isn't about that." He paused for a moment, then added, "Get in, or you can go back to sketching on the sidewalk and wondering where your next meal is coming from." Layla's stomach churned, not from hunger, but from the weight of her reality. Homeless for months after losing her job and apartment, she had been sleeping in shelters and scrounging for whatever scraps of dignity remained. She hated his bluntness, but hated her own desperation even more. After a few tense seconds, she opened the car door and slipped into the passenger seat, slamming it shut with more force than necessary. The silence between them was suffocating, but Henry didn't seem to mind. He drove through the city until they reached a quiet cafe on the outskirts of town, far from the crowded noise of downtown. Inside, the warmth of the cafe wrapped around Layla, a stark contrast to the cold autumn breeze she had left behind. She sat across from Henry at a small corner table, her hands wrapped around a cup of steaming coffee he had ordered for her. She hadn't had real coffee in weeks, but she sipped it cautiously, unsure of what would come next. "So," she said finally, breaking the silence. "What's this about?" Henry leaned forward, his eyes locked on hers. "I need someone to carry a child for me." Layla almost choked on her coffee. She set the cup down, laughing nervously. "What?" "I'm serious," Henry said, his tone unwavering. "This isn't a joke. I'm offering you a contract. You'll be taken care of throughout the pregnancy. You'll live comfortably. And in the end, you'll receive a substantial payment. Enough to start over. Enough to never worry about money again." Layla stared at him, searching for any sign that he might be bluffing. But his expression was cold, calculated, and completely serious. "You expect me to just have your baby and hand it over like it's nothing?" Her voice wavered, anger and disbelief blending into every word. Henry didn't flinch. "I'm offering you a way out," he said, his voice calm and persuasive. "No strings. No emotional ties. Just a contract. You'll be free to leave once it's done, with enough money to rebuild your life." Layla sat back in her chair, arms crossed defensively. Her mind raced. She hated the idea of being used, of turning something so personal into a transaction. But the truth was, she didn't have many options. Every day was a fight to survive. "And if I say no?" she asked, testing him. "Then you go back to the streets," Henry replied bluntly. "You keep struggling, keep living in fear of what tomorrow might bring. But if you say yes, you'll have security, stability, and a future." Layla clenched her fists under the table. She wanted to walk away, to prove she had enough dignity not to entertain such an outrageous offer. But her mind kept returning to the nights she spent shivering on park benches, the days she spent going hungry. His words, no matter how harsh, were the truth. "What's the catch?" she asked. "Why me? Why not some rich socialite who'd be thrilled to give you a perfect child?" Henry's gaze darkened, and for the first time, his voice softened just slightly. "Because I want control. I don't want someone from my world who will make demands or complicate things. I need someone who understands that this is a business arrangement, nothing more." Layla sat in silence, the weight of the decision pressing down on her. She wasn't stupid. She knew what she was giving up. But she also knew what she stood to gain. "I need time to think," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Henry nodded, as if he had expected this response. "You have 24 hours. After that, the offer's off the table." Without another word, he stood and walked toward the exit, leaving Layla alone in the cafe, staring into the depths of her coffee cup as her thoughts spiraled. This wasn't just a decision about money. It was a decision about her future, her body, and her heart. The streets of New York were quieter than usual as night fell, but Layla's mind was anything but calm. She walked aimlessly, replaying Henry's words over and over again. Security, stability, a new life. It sounded like a dream, but at what cost? Could she really give up a child she hadn't even conceived yet? Her footsteps slowed as she reached the park where she often slept. The biting wind cut through her thin jacket, and the sight of the familiar bench filled her with dread. This was her reality, a hard, unforgiving world where survival left no room for dignity. She sat down and pulled her knees to her chest, staring at the dark sky. Her mother's voice echoed in her mind, a memory from years ago. "Opportunities don't come often, Layla. When they do, you either grab them or let them pass you by." But this wasn't an opportunity she had imagined. She wasn't being offered a job or a second chance at her dreams. She was being asked to give someone a child. Tears welled in her eyes, but she wiped them away quickly. She had cried too many times before, and tears had never changed anything. If she wanted to escape this life, maybe this was her chance, no matter how painful the price. By dawn, her mind was made up. With trembling fingers, she called the number Henry had given her, barely able to believe she was doing this. After 2 rings, he answered. "Layla?" "Yes," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I'll do it." Henry's response was brief, but satisfied. "Good. Meet me at my office in an hour." The Lewis Enterprises building was a towering symbol of success, its glass walls gleaming in the early morning light. Layla walked through the grand lobby, feeling out of place among the business professionals who moved with purpose. She tightened her grip on her bag, trying to ignore the curious stares of receptionists and executives. When she reached Henry's private office on the top floor, his assistant, Stephanie, greeted her warmly. She was a woman in her mid-30s, with a kind smile that eased some of Layla's anxiety. "Mr. Lewis is ready for you," she said, leading her inside. Henry was seated behind an enormous oak desk, flipping through a stack of papers. He looked up as she entered, his expression as composed as ever. "You made the right choice," he said, gesturing for her to sit. "Let's hope so," Layla replied, her voice firmer than she expected. Henry handed her a thick document, the contract. "This outlines everything we discussed. You'll be taken care of throughout the pregnancy. Your medical expenses, housing, and any personal needs will be covered. Once the child is born, you'll receive a substantial payment and be free to leave with no further obligations." Layla scanned the document, her fingers tracing the fine print. Every clause was carefully worded, leaving no room for ambiguity. She stopped when she reached the section about the baby. "After the birth, I have no rights to see them," she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Henry nodded. "Correct. That's part of the deal. Once you've delivered the baby, your life is yours to rebuild." Layla's chest tightened. She forced herself to continue reading. The money he was offering could change everything. A chance to go back to school, find a home, maybe even restart her career in art. But no amount of money could erase the emotional cost she was about to pay. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, lowering the contract. "You could adopt, you could find a surrogate from an agency, you could—" "Because I want control," Henry interrupted, his voice steady, but not unkind. "I want a child of my own blood, someone who carries my legacy. And I don't want complications." Layla nodded, understanding the cold logic behind his words. He wasn't heartless. He was practical. For Henry, this was just another calculated investment. Taking a deep breath, she picked up the pen and signed her name at the bottom of the page. The moment the ink dried, she felt like she had signed away a part of herself, but she kept her expression blank. Henry stood, extending his hand. "Welcome to the arrangement." Layla shook it, her grip firm despite the storm brewing inside her. Stephanie entered the office moments later, carrying a folder filled with details about the next steps. "I'll be helping you get settled," she said warmly. "We'll make sure you're comfortable." As Stephanie led her out of the office, Layla glanced back at Henry. He was already on the phone, back to business, as if signing her into this life-altering agreement was just another task to cross off his list. Once outside, Stephanie guided her to a waiting car. "We'll take you to the mansion now," she said with a smile. "It's beautiful. You'll be living there for the duration of the pregnancy." Layla nodded numbly as the car pulled away from the city's noise. She stared out the window, watching the world blur past her. She had a roof over her head, security, and a chance to rebuild her life. But she also had a growing ache in her chest, a whisper of doubt that wouldn't go away. For now, she could only hope she had made the right decision. The mansion was everything Layla expected, grand, cold, and suffocating in its perfection. Immaculate gardens stretched out like a painting, and the marble floors inside echoed her footsteps as Stephanie showed her around. Layla's suite was larger than any apartment she had ever lived in. The bed had linen sheets softer than clouds, and the bathroom was bigger than the tiny studio she had once rented. But despite the luxury, the space felt empty, as though it had been designed for appearances, not warmth. Layla sat on the edge of the bed, running her fingers across the sheets, trying to convince herself that this was her chance to finally be comfortable. but she couldn't shake the feeling that she was more of a guest at a business retreat than someone being cared for. Her days quickly fell into a routine. Doctors came regularly to check on her health. Meals, prepared by chefs, arrived at her suite like clockwork. Stephanie was always nearby, making sure she had everything she needed. But Henry remained distant, just as she expected. Aside from brief, formal check-ins, he barely spoke to her. Until one morning, when everything changed. Layla had been sitting on the balcony attached to her suite, sketching in a notebook she had bought with her first payment from Henry. The crisp air felt good against her skin, and for a moment, she lost herself in the familiar rhythm of drawing, soft, precise strokes capturing the trees swaying gently below. "You draw a lot," a voice said from behind her. Layla jumped, her pencil nearly slipping from her fingers. She turned to see Henry standing at the balcony door, dressed impeccably in a tailored suit. His gaze wasn't cold, but curious. "I didn't think you noticed," she said, her voice cautious. "I notice more than you think," he replied, stepping onto the balcony. He looked down at her sketch, a half-finished image of the garden, and nodded in approval. "You're good?" Layla narrowed her eyes. "Is that why you're here? To compliment my sketches?" Henry smirked faintly. "No. I came to check on you. Stephanie said you've been spending a lot of time alone. I wanted to see if you're adjusting." "I'm fine," she replied quickly, but her tone betrayed her. Henry noticed. He sat in the chair across from her, something she didn't expect him to do. He didn't seem like the type to linger in casual conversations. But today he stayed. "Are you really?" he asked softly. Layla looked down at her sketch, her fingers tracing the edges of the paper. "It's not easy, you know. Being here, knowing this isn't really my home. Knowing that in a few months, I'll leave and never see any of this again." She gestured vaguely to the sprawling gardens. "Or the baby." Henry leaned back, resting his elbows on the chair's armrests. For the first time, he didn't have a response prepared. "I know this was supposed to be simple," she continued. "Just a business arrangement. But it's not, is it?" "No," he admitted, surprising both of them. "It's not." Silence fell between them, but it wasn't the awkward kind they had grown used to. It was heavy, meaningful, and filled with unspoken emotions neither of them were ready to address. Finally, Layla stood, tucking her sketchbook under her arm. "Thanks for checking in, but I'm fine." "Really?" She walked past him, leaving him on the balcony. But as she closed the door behind her, she couldn't help but wonder why Henry had lingered. That evening, Henry found himself unable to focus on the mountain of paperwork waiting for him in his office. His thoughts kept drifting back to the conversation on the balcony, to the vulnerability in Layla's voice when she talked about leaving the baby. He had always thought he could compartmentalize emotions, keep things clean, efficient. But something about her was breaking down the walls he had spent years building, and that scared him. Meanwhile, Layla lay in bed, staring at the ceiling as the wind rustled the trees outside her window. She thought about Henry's unexpected softness, the way he had listened instead of dismissing her feelings. For the first time since signing the contract, she saw him as something more than just a cold businessman. Maybe there was more to him than she had given him credit for. The next morning, during breakfast in the grand dining room, Layla was surprised when Henry sat at the table with her instead of taking his meal in his office as usual. "Good morning," he said, his tone warmer than she expected. "Morning," she replied cautiously. They ate in silence for a few minutes until Henry broke it. "I was thinking," he said, setting down his fork. "You should take some time to do something you enjoy. Drawing, exploring the city, anything. I'll arrange for transportation and security if you want to go anywhere." Layla blinked, taken aback. "Why?" He hesitated before answering, as though he was carefully choosing his words. "Because I want you to feel like you're more than just a part of a deal. You're carrying my child. That means something, even if we didn't plan for it to." Layla's heart thumped in her chest. She had spent so much time thinking of Henry as a man who saw her as nothing more than a means to an end. But now he was showing glimpses of something deeper. Compassion, maybe even guilt. "Thank you," she said softly. "I'll think about it." Later that day, a knock at her door interrupted her sketching. When she opened it, Stephanie stood there with a package in her hands. "From Mr. Lewis," she said with a smile. Layla unwrapped it and found a brand new sketchbook along with a set of high-quality pencils. Tucked inside was a handwritten note. "For when inspiration strikes. Don't let this place take away what you love." Layla sat on her bed, staring at the gift. She traced her fingers over the cover of the sketchbook, her thoughts spinning. For the first time, she wondered if this arrangement wasn't just changing her life, but Henry's as well. The following weeks brought a subtle but undeniable shift. Henry, once distant and cold, began to show up more often, whether it was during her daily walks in the garden or sitting across from her at breakfast. Their conversations were still cautious, but Layla could feel the emotional wall between them thinning. One evening, Layla found herself sitting on the mansion's grand terrace, the cool night air brushing her skin as she looked up at the stars. She was lost in thought when she heard the sound of footsteps behind her. She didn't have to turn around to know it was Henry. "Can't sleep?" he asked, stepping beside her. "Too many thoughts," she replied, hugging her knees to her chest. "What about you?" He shrugged, his gaze fixed on the dark sky. "Thinking about the future." Layla let out a small laugh. "You? The man who plans everything down to the last detail is worried about the future." Henry smirked, but his expression soon grew serious. "This is different. The twins aren't a project I can manage, or a business deal I can negotiate. They're unpredictable." He paused, as if the admission itself was foreign to him. "And that scares me?" Layla turned to face him, surprised by his honesty. "You're not used to things you can't control, are you?" "No," he said quietly. "I've built my entire life around avoiding chaos. But this, what we're building, it's chaos, Layla. Beautiful chaos." Her heart skipped a beat at his words. "You make it sound like that's a bad thing." Henry hesitated before responding, his gaze softening. "It's not. It just takes some getting used to." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment before Layla spoke again. "I heard the twins' heartbeats at the last checkup," she said, her voice almost a whisper. "It was the most surreal thing I've ever experienced. I thought I could stay emotionally distant." But she trailed off, her hand resting gently on her growing belly. Henry nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. "I was there too," he admitted. "I didn't say anything, but hearing those heartbeats changed something in me." Layla looked up at him, her blue eyes meeting his for a long moment. "What if we're both in over our heads?" she asked softly. "Then we figure it out," Henry replied, his voice steady. "Together." The vulnerability in his tone left her breathless. She had never seen this side of him, the man behind the billionaire persona, the man who seemed as lost and unsure as she felt. A few days later, Henry insisted on accompanying Layla to her next prenatal appointment. They sat side by side in the waiting room, an awkward silence lingering between them. But when the doctor called them in, Henry didn't hesitate to stand and follow. The ultrasound technician applied the gel to Layla's stomach, and within moments, the rhythmic sound of heartbeats filled the room. But this time, something was different. "Well," the doctor said with a smile, "I have a little surprise for you both." He pointed at the screen, where two tiny figures were visible. "You're having twins." Layla gasped, her hand instinctively covering her mouth. "Twins?" The doctor nodded. "Everything looks healthy, and they're developing perfectly." Henry sat frozen, his eyes locked on the screen. For the first time, he seemed genuinely speechless. The car ride back to the mansion was unusually quiet. Layla kept glancing at Henry, wondering what he was thinking, but his expression was unreadable. When they arrived home, he walked her to the door before finally breaking the silence. "Two lives," he said softly. "Two futures." Layla exhaled, feeling the weight of the moment settle between them. "Does that change anything for you?" Henry's gaze met hers, and for the first time, there was no mask, no calculated facade. Everything, he admitted. It changes everything. That night, as Layla lay in bed, her hands resting on her belly, she couldn't help but think about Henry's words. They had entered this arrangement as strangers, bound only by a contract. But now, with two lives growing inside her and emotions swirling between them, it was clear that their carefully constructed plan had become something far more complicated and far more meaningful. Days passed, and the revelation of twins brought both joy and tension to the mansion. Layla and Henry's interactions became more frequent, but with that closeness came vulnerability. Henry had always thrived on control, but now he was navigating a storm of emotions he couldn't suppress. One night, Layla found herself pacing the nursery, staring at the two cribs being set up by the staff. She ran her fingers over the soft blankets and tiny mobiles, her mind swirling with doubt. Could she really leave when the time came? Hearing footsteps, she turned to see Henry standing in the doorway, his shirt sleeves rolled up, his tie loosened, a rare sight for the man who was always impeccably put together. "You can't sleep either?" he asked, stepping inside. Layla shook her head. "It's hard to stop thinking." Henry walked over to one of the cribs, tracing the edge of the wooden frame. "I know the contract we signed seemed clear. I thought I had everything figured out when we made the deal." He turned to face her, and for the first time, his eyes weren't cold, they were pleading. "But I was wrong. Nothing about this feels simple anymore." Layla swallowed hard. "What are you saying, Henry?" He hesitated, then took a step closer. "I'm saying I don't want you to leave after the twins are born. I can't just let you walk away." Her breath hitched, and she felt the familiar ache in her chest. She wanted to believe him, but fear still held her back. "We had an agreement," she whispered, tears threatening to spill. "I can't pretend this is something it's not." Henry reached for her hands, holding them tightly. "This isn't about the contract anymore, Layla. It's about you. About us." His voice cracked slightly, the vulnerability shocking even him. "I've spent my life avoiding connections because I was scared of what they'd cost me. But being with you has shown me that the real cost is living without them." Layla pulled her hands away, stepping back as her emotions overwhelmed her. "What if you're just saying this because of the twins? What if, once they're here, you realize you don't need me anymore?" Henry's face softened, and he stepped closer again. "This isn't just about the babies. I want you, Layla. I want us to build something together, not because I need an heir, but because I need you." The weight of his words shattered the walls she had built around her heart. Tears streamed down her face as she let herself feel the love she had tried so hard to ignore. But fear still lingered. "What if we fail, Henry? What if this ends up like your past relationships?" "We won't," he said firmly, "because this time I'm not walking into it looking for control. I'm walking into it knowing that love isn't something you plan for, it's something you fight for." Layla's chest tightened as she wiped her tears away. Her mind was telling her to be cautious, but her heart had already decided. She stepped forward, closing the distance between them, and wrapped her arms around him. "We fight together then," she whispered, her voice trembling. Henry exhaled, relief washing over him as he held her close. For the first time, they weren't just two people bound by an agreement. They were partners, ready to face the unknown together. Later that night, as they lay side by side in bed, Henry whispered, "You changed me, Layla, and I'll spend the rest of my life proving to you that it's real." Layla smiled through her tears, her head resting on his chest as the rhythmic beat of his heart lulled her to sleep. For the first time, the future didn't seem so uncertain. The morning sun streamed through the windows of the mansion as the sound of soft baby cries echoed down the hall. Layla woke with a start, her body still adjusting to the demands of carrying twins. She rubbed her belly gently, feeling the slight kicks beneath her fingertips. When she walked into the nursery, Henry was already there, pacing with a stuffed animal in hand, his brow furrowed in concentration. One of the twins' cribs had a mobile gently spinning overhead, and the soft lull of a nursery rhyme played in the background. "You're practicing already?" Layla teased, leaning against the doorway. Henry turned, a sheepish smile creeping onto his face. "Better to be prepared. I heard twins are a handful." Layla laughed softly and walked over to him. "They are. But we'll survive." They stood in the nursery for a while, the warmth of the moment surrounding them. But as much as she wanted to stay in this peaceful bubble, reality was always there, waiting to knock on the door of her heart. "What happens now, Henry?" Layla asked, her voice hesitant. "I know we said we'd face this together, but once the twins are here, do you still want me to stay?" "What if?" Henry cut her off by taking her hand. "I'm not going to wake up one day and regret this. I don't want you to be afraid of the future anymore." He led her to the rocking chair by the window and helped her sit down, his fingers lingering briefly on her arm. "We've built something here, Layla, and it's not something I'm willing to let go of." Layla nodded, tears welling up again. "I just want to be enough. Not for the twins. For you." Henry knelt in front of her, cupping her face with his hands. "You are enough. You always were." The following weeks were a whirlwind of preparation. The nursery was fully furnished with everything they could possibly need, and Stephanie helped organize every detail of the birth plan. But in the midst of all the planning, there were quiet moments where Henry and Layla simply existed together, reading parenting books on the couch, walking through the gardens, or lying in bed talking about names for the twins. Henry was no longer the cold, detached businessman she had once feared. He laughed more. He asked her opinion on things. He shared memories from his childhood, moments of vulnerability that showed her the man he was beyond the suit and tie. But the biggest shift came one night when Layla was sitting in bed, flipping through her sketchbook. Henry entered the room, carrying a tray with 2 cups of tea. "You didn't have to do that," she said, smiling. "I wanted to," he replied, setting the tray down and sitting beside her. As she sipped the tea, he picked up her sketchbook and flipped through the pages. "These are beautiful," he said, pausing on a sketch of the twins' cribs. "You should be sharing this with the world." Layla shook her head. "It's just for me. For now, at least." Henry set the book aside and leaned in, his voice soft. "I want you to have dreams beyond this house, Layla. Beyond me. I want you to keep creating, keep doing what makes you happy." Her breath hitched at the sincerity in his voice. "Henry, you've already given me so much." "And I'll keep giving," he replied. "Because I want you to have more than just a new life. I want you to have everything you ever dreamed of." Tears fell freely as she leaned into him, her heart bursting with gratitude and love. One evening, as they prepared for bed, Layla clutched Henry's hand. "There's something I've been meaning to ask you," she said, her voice hesitant. He raised an eyebrow. "What is it?" "What if we named the twins together? I thought you'd want to decide on your own, but I think it would mean a lot if we did it together." Henry smiled, his heart swelling. "I'd like that." And so they spent the night tossing names back and forth, laughing at the ridiculous ones and falling silent when the perfect ones came to mind. By dawn, they had decided. For the boy, Liam Henry Lewis, and for the girl, Amelia Grace Lewis. When the sun rose, Layla felt something she hadn't experienced in a long time, peace. She had walked into this arrangement unsure of everything. But now, with Henry by her side and 2 new lives about to enter the world, she finally felt ready to face the future. The day finally arrived. The morning air was crisp and fresh as the car sped through the streets toward the hospital. Layla clutched Henry's hand tightly, breathing through the contractions that seemed to come faster and stronger with each passing minute. Henry sat beside her, his usual composed demeanor cracked just enough to reveal the nervous excitement beneath the surface. "You're doing great," he whispered, squeezing her hand. Layla smiled through the pain. "I'm holding you to that when I yell at you later." He chuckled, but the tension in the car remained heavy as the hospital came into view. Within minutes, she was surrounded by a team of doctors and nurses, and Henry, refusing to leave her side, changed into scrubs and followed her into the delivery room. The hours that followed were a blur of pain, determination, and emotion. Henry held her hand through every contraction, whispering words of encouragement, his fingers laced with hers, as if he were anchoring her to reality. Finally, the first cry filled the room, a sound that made time stop. "It's a boy," the doctor announced with a smile, placing the tiny baby into the nurse's arms. Layla's body trembled as tears streamed down her face. Moments later, the second cry pierced the air. "And a girl," the doctor said, gently cradling the second baby before handing her off. Henry stood frozen, his breath catching in his throat as he looked between the two babies. He had imagined this moment, planned for it meticulously, but nothing had prepared him for the overwhelming wave of emotion that struck him like a tidal wave. Layla, exhausted but beaming, extended her hand toward him. "We did it, Henry." He nodded, unable to speak, and when the nurse handed him their son, his arms instinctively cradled the tiny bundle. He looked down at Liam, his heart pounding, as if the world had been rebuilt in that single moment. "Hey, buddy," he whispered, his voice rough with emotion. Layla held Amelia, her small fingers wrapping around Layla's thumb. "They're perfect," she whispered, staring in awe at the tiny beings she had carried for 9 months. Henry sat beside her on the hospital bed, their children nestled between them. For a long while, they simply sat there, no words necessary, their hearts intertwined as they soaked in the miracle of new life. Back at the mansion a few days later, life settled into a new rhythm. The nursery, once a symbol of uncertainty, had become the heart of the home. Layla and Henry spent their days tending to the twins, changing diapers, rocking them to sleep, and sharing moments of quiet joy. One evening, as the twins napped peacefully in their cribs, Layla found herself on the terrace, the night breeze brushing against her skin. She wrapped her arms around herself and stared at the city lights in the distance. Despite everything, doubt still crept into her heart. Would this happiness last? Thinking again, Henry's voice came from behind her. She turned, smiling softly. "I can't help it." He stepped beside her, slipping an arm around her waist. "What's on your mind?" Layla took a deep breath, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. "I'm afraid of losing this." "Of losing you?" Henry turned her to face him, his gaze steady and full of conviction. "You're not going to lose me. We've built this together, and I'm not walking away. Ever." Layla's eyes filled with tears, but this time, they weren't tears of fear. They were tears of hope. "You've given me so much," she whispered. "A family, a second chance, love. I don't know how to thank you for that." Henry smiled, pulling her into his arms. "You've given me something I never thought I'd have, Layla. You made me believe in love, in chaos, in everything I was too afraid to face." He leaned down, his lips brushing her softly. "We'll be okay." As they stood there, wrapped in each other's warmth, the sound of Liam's soft cries echoed from the nursery. "I guess that's our cue," Layla said with a laugh, wiping her tears away. Henry chuckled. "I'll get him. You take care of Amelia." They walked back inside, side by side, where their future awaited them. The twins would grow, and life would bring its challenges. But as long as they had each other, they knew they could face anything. In the nursery, Henry picked up Liam, gently rocking him as the baby's cries subsided. He looked over at Layla, who was cradling Amelia and humming softly. It wasn't a perfect life. It wasn't what either of them had planned. But it was real, and it was theirs. As the night settled in, Henry whispered to the tiny boy in his arms, "You have no idea how much you and your sister have already changed us." He looked at Layla, his heart full. "And we're just getting started." Layla smiled at him, her eyes filled with love. "I think this is exactly where we're supposed to be." And in that moment, with their family complete, they knew they had found something that no contract could ever capture. Love that was earned, fought for, and everlasting.